Okay, I'm Wendell Stevens, Lieutenant Colonel, United States Air Force, retired. I have been investigating this phenomena for over 50 years. It actually began in the Air Force when I was reassigned to Alaska. I was working in the Foreign Technology Division of the Air Technical Intelligence Center at Wright Field, Dayton, Ohio. I was a test pilot in the Flight Test Division there. All pilots had to have an additional, actually a primary duty. Flying was your additional duty. So my primary duty was in the Air Technical Intelligence Center screening the captured war documents from the former enemies, and they were coming in by the ship road to the ports and the truckload to Air Materiel Command. I had save lists from our contractors, government contractors. I had save lists from the government. We had our own save lists, and I had my own particular save list. And what we didn't save was sent to the shredder, was shredded and burned. And some interesting things came back. One thing, for example, that went across my desk that I later was very sorry about was a map from Germany. It was a battle map, and it was in color, and it showed the array of forces near the end of the war, near the collapse of Germany, and it showed what the forces coming from the east and from the west, and what looked like an escape corridor to the south if anybody wanted to get out. That was all white. Now on that map were 9 little Saturn-shaped symbols stamped on with a rubber stamp. And I didn't know what they were, and I didn't know what they meant at the time, and I sent the map to the shredder and it was burned. And later I found that those were the Kugelblitz development facilities run by the Germans, where they developed their own disk programs. And then I was sorry that I had destroyed it. But later I found a copy of a similar map in a book published in Canada on what they called the Samizdat Press by Mattern and Friedrich, that showed a similar map, or maybe even the same map, that showed those 9 positions with the little Saturn-shaped symbols. And they were explained as representing the 9 research facilities developed by the Germans for that program. That program, incidentally, was kept under the tightest control by the SS. It developed under the SS, and they decided to keep it under their control in a special staff office called the Entwicklungsstelle SSE4. And they controlled all of the development information on the various disk programs. They had several go. By the time the war ended, they had 9. Now, when the Germans were reversed in Russia and they saw they weren't going to win the war anymore, they began dismantling those factories and evacuating them. The ones that they couldn't successfully dismantle, they just blew up and destroyed them. We believe that the Russians captured one partly intact, enough to get some information out of it. We were unable to capture an intact facility, but we did capture something like 9 of their disks in various stages of development and shipped them back to White Sands Missile Test Area. Project Sign, as I said, was organized on the ground floor as a public information office. And they were only given information that was purged and sent down to them from upstairs. So what they got had a lot of blacked out, censorship blacked out on their reports, and they had to conclude for the public what that caused the situation from what was already deleted, which they didn't know. So the public accepted the idea that this was the agency to contact on new reports, and they began to get letter reports from the public itself, which were different from the reports that were coming down from upstairs. And they found that there seemed to be things really happening that were not, the upstairs didn't seem to know about. So they started following up on some of these letters and began to go out and look at a few of the cases, and decided that there was more to this than meets the eye, and more than they were getting from upstairs. So they thought they were helping by the upstairs by collecting information, and they tried to investigate more and more and send it upstairs. This defeated the purpose, because now instead of explaining it all to the public, they're raising the interest level. So they closed Project Sign, boxed all the records, and reassigned everybody. Then the cases continued, and reports kept coming in. The public now wants to know, well, who's going to handle it now? Where's the office we report these things to? So they had to reopen the office someplace, and the Air Force didn't want to take it. They did everything they could do to avoid it. They tried to get the government to give it to NASA. They tried to get them to give it to the Navy. They tried to get them to give it to the Army. They tried to avoid it every way they could, and finally the Chief of Staff of the Air Force says, no, you're going to take it. So they reopened the boxes and named it Project Grudge, appropriately named. This time they assigned a first lieutenant and a second lieutenant, 3 sergeants, and 2 secretaries. And someplace midway in Project Grudge, they added a captain, replaced the first lieutenant with a captain, Captain Ruppelt. The same thing happened with Project Sign, and Ruppelt began investigating cases on his own, a kind of a maverick. He didn't have authorization to do it, but he was getting information that was meaningful, and he would follow up on it. And he finally he collected his own information. He wrote a book, and he sold the book to a Book of the Month publishing house, and they published it. And when the Air Force found out about it, they ordered the publishing house to recall all the books and have the last chapter rewritten. Ruppelt had concluded that there was certainly something going on here with the last words, only time will tell. The government made him rewrite the whole last chapter, saying that there was really nothing to this, and that it was not worth spending a lot of money on investigating. And that was republished and sent out in the place of the first edition. So you can tell if you have an original edition, if it has if the last 3 words in the book say only time will tell, that's the original edition. Government failed to catch them all. There's a few out, but not many. The rest of them will have a different ending to the book. That was written by Captain Ruppelt. Now Ruppelt, because he did that, and because the staff now is looking for cases and collecting information, they closed Project Grudge. And the Air Force once more tried to get rid of it. Or again, they were ordered to take it on. So this time they looked for an officer, a climber, that will obey all the instructions. He tries to please his commander the best way he can all the time, anxious to be promoted. They found that in the form of Major Hector Quintanilla. When the commander of Air Materiel Command interviewed him and told him that he was going to be given all the material the Air Force had on the subject, and he was going to have to answer to the public, report to the public on this. He thought and wanted to believe and did believe that he had everything in his office. He still only had a ceiling classification of confidential. He only had purged reports, but he didn't care. He's trying to please his superiors by saying, and he really believed, I think, that he was being given everything. And that rocked along that way until the government hired the Condon. They were looking for somebody to take the wind out of the sails of the UFO phenomena, and they hired the Condon Committee to run an official investigation and find out if it was really necessary for the government to get into this investigation. Well, of course, they're in it all the time at the upper staff level, but they're trying to keep the public from knowing about that. So they found the one they were looking for in the form of the University of Colorado, which owed the government a few things, and they paid them $500,000 to run a proper investigation with a specific finding. Now, what kind of an investigation is that? They had to find what they found. That was what they were paid for. So they hired people that they thought would follow toe the line, would follow the directions of the director of the project, who was, gosh, I forget, Condon, Ulysses Condon from the Colorado University. And he had scientists that didn't agree with this project, and they felt independent, and one of them wrote a book, UFO'S, Yes. Two more quit the project. When it came to writing the final report, they wrote the final report they thought it ought to get, and when it got to Condon, he said, no, we can't do that. And he rewrote the report. And that report that came out of that was Condon's report himself, and he cut out all the stuff that would support anything, and ended with a conclusion that there was not enough indication that this was a serious matter for the Air Force to be expending any more money in conducting research and investigating the cases. But an upper staff continued to do that anyway, and it was more people and more heavily funded than ever before. But that's what the projects were. So they closed Project Blue Book, sent all the files to the Air University at Montgomery, Alabama. That's where they are today. They're closed files. There is no public information office at this time to answer the question. If you look any place, they say the project was closed and the files are at Montgomery, Alabama. Go look at them. At that time, the government had a standard rotation project. All the active duty officers would spend 2 years in the zone of interior, that's the United States, and then 2 years out of the zone of interior, that's an overseas assignment. And they'd rotate you back and forth. So I had been in the States for 2 years at the Air Materiel Command, and I was coming up for rotational reassignment. And I was supposed to be reassigned overseas for another 2 years, and when it came, it was an assignment to Anchorage, Alaska. Now, at that time, Alaska was a province, or it was a territory of the United States, and it was considered an overseas assignment because it was not part of the zone of interior at that time. And so when I got to Alaska, I found that I had been reassigned to a position outside of my specialty. My specialty was logistics, and I was assigned up there in an operations specialty, which I had no training for. And when I got to Anchorage, I found that I was going to be the assistant base operations officer for a properly trained base operations officer. But my additional duty would be to supervise a team of highly qualified, high classified civilian technicians, career technicians, that were installing special equipment aboard the B-29s that were being winterized in Anchorage Air Depot, and then flew their target profiles on Russia and coming back. And every crew had to fly this once every year. So the B-29s were already flying in the Arctic. We had a lot of reports indicating that the phenomena was coming from the Arctic. I think there was an upper staff level that thought the Russians might have developed something and be trying to use it or to experiment with it. We knew that the Russians had captured part of one of the Kugelblitz factories way up in Northwood on the Russian border. It was north of Poland. And so I think that's what the upper staff had in mind when they set this project up. Now, what we did to the B-29s, after they were winterized, where they changed the rubber seals to neoprene seals, a lot of things like that, so they wouldn't break down in the cold, then my team would of civilians would install extra 35 millimeter cameras aboard. There's already a 16 millimeter cameras. There's a 16 millimeter camera in every gun position already on the B-29. We gave them a couple more handheld 16 millimeter cameras to carry around. We put a 35 millimeter camera aboard. We even had we had four 4x5 press cameras that took pictures on a 4-inch by 5-inch negative, good pictures on high density film. We put a Fairchild K20 camera aboard, which takes a picture on an 8-inch by 10-inch negative, a heavy thing that was hard to even carry around. We installed surge detectors in every electrical system on the B-29. I think there's 5. We installed radio frequency emission scanners aboard that scanned the radio frequency spectrum, homed on the strongest signal, copied it for 30 seconds, canceled it, and homed again until it got the next strongest signal, canceled that till it canceled them all, then it'd start over. And it recorded for 30 seconds, then start over. So this continually went on. We also installed ambient thermal detectors to measure rises in the ambient temperature aboard the aircraft. We installed magnetic detectors to tell us if there's any changes in the magnetic field at the times. But it was a good kit of equipment. And every time they experienced an incident, they were required to report back in a coded report to the home base, and we knew when they were coming in if they had experienced an incident. When they landed, we'd separate all the crew members and put them in separate rooms, and then interrogate them one at a time with stenographers taking down their testimony on what they saw. And all of that would be packaged with the film rolls, the cartridges, the cassettes, everything was downloaded from the equipment that we'd put aboard. And that would be packed in a metal box and chained to an officer's wrist and flown to Washington that night. So I never got to see any of that because there was no way for me to read it, the tapes, no way for me to develop pictures in time. They didn't want me to do it anyway. I was forbidden to do anything but debrief the crews and sign the reports and send them to Washington. So I know that we sent some interesting cases forward. I've never heard of those cases since then. One of the cases, for instance, involved a 200-foot diameter disc, estimated, sitting on the ice pack ahead of an approaching B-29, and as the B-29 got close enough to get a pretty good look at it, it jumped into the air and flew away. Now this 200-foot diameter ship left the ground, leaving nothing behind, no ground equipment, not even an oil slick on the ground. When we'd launch a B-29 for those missions, we had a sea of equipment around the B-29, bigger than the B-29 ever was, left behind when it took off. And so this was a unique. There's no way we could launch anything up there that way, and somebody else is doing it all the time, apparently. They also came on one time that was sitting on the water and submerged as it got closer and went under the water and disappeared. Another report we had was of one that emerged from the water and flew away in front of the B-29. We had one report where estimated 60-foot diameter disc got in the slot between the big wing and the little wing on the right side of the airplane, and they got pictures with all the cameras and the recording equipment aboard the airplane, electrical disturbances, radio frequency disturbance, magnetic disturbance, all of those things in one incident, and they rotated the crews past the window on that side so they could all get a look at it, including the forward crews. And those were sent to Washington. You never heard any of those. So they go someplace, and they're someplace in the files, but we've never heard of them and probably never see them. That was what I was doing in Alaska. Well, I have to believe that there's a cover-up going on. By the way, my superior, Major Moss, who left before I did, about 6 months before I did, and came back to the States, my wife and I had developed a friendly relationship with him where we'd go to dinner with, play cards with him at night and everything. And when we rotated back from the Alaskan Theater, we were coming through California, and he had become the base operations officer at McClellan Air Force Base, which was headquarters Western Air Defense Force area. So we're spending the night in his apartment on base at McClellan, and I asked him about whatever happened to all the stuff, the information that we were collecting, and he said, well, you know, he said, I didn't believe that it was real at the time, but he said, when I got down here, I found that there's file cabinets full of information. Everything west of the Mississippi is reported through here. So, and he said, it's a lot more highly classified than you think, and there's big offices involved, but it's all clandestine. It's all kept very carefully under control. So he had become convinced. And when I tried to follow the reports I sent to Washington one time when I was there, they told me I didn't have a classification for any of that. Besides, I didn't have any business looking for it. I said, well, I sent some of it. It doesn't make any difference. You're not in the need-to-know loop. We don't know anything about it. But I can tell you what happens to those cases. We had an incident that happened over Tucson in, oh gosh, I think it was about 1975 or 76, where a B-29 bomber was refueling on a tanker over the Catalina Mountains north of Tucson. And while they were doing this, a big disc, about 60 feet in diameter, came in close to the refueling operation as though it was observing it, and both the tanker crew and the B-29 crew watched it. And it stayed there for 12 to 15 minutes. They all rotated the crews again. Everybody got a look at it. They reported this in their coded reporting, and when the airplane landed, the crews were separated and into separate rooms, and headquarters, Air Defense Force, Western Air Defense Force area was notified. They had an official Air Force UFO investigation team, and that team was headed by a major. He had about 2 staff sergeants. He had a tech sergeant. I think he even had a master sergeant on the team. He had another officer with him, and when the case was reported, Western Air Defense Force area said, keep them separated, we're on our way over. And they arrived the same day in military aircraft. And they set up interviews the next morning in the base courthouse at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base. And they were bringing the crews in one at a time for separate interrogation, and stenographers were taking, like we did in Alaska, taking down their testimony. The siren blew, and they were going to break for lunch. There the siren blows, everybody goes to lunch, you're all back at 1 o'clock. So they stopped their interviews and said, okay, lunch break, and they all started out the door. And when Rudy Pestalozzi went out the door with his team, they see a lot of people standing in the streets all looking up with their mouths open. They looked up, and here's the silvery disc and high station, and another one zipping back and forth over the field like this. By the way, this is the time this has ever been told publicly. So the one that was flying low over the streets then went up on high station, and the top one came down and did the same thing. For about 15 minutes this went on. The people, when the phenomena left, the people went to lunch, but they brought speakers on the base, started ordering everybody to their sections for a briefing. Meantime, the section commanders and staff officers were told to assemble their people and tell them that this was a military exercise that they had observed, and it was a secret exercise, and it would be worth their job to say anything to anybody about it, even their family at home. And they successfully kept that down. Now, Rudy and his team ran back in and got their equipment. They had 2 4x5 press cameras. They had 2 35mm hand cameras, all of them full of film. They had an 8mm movie camera, and they had rolls of film for that. And they got out in the street, and they started shooting pictures and taking movies of what's going on. When they got through, they had quite a bit. They had several rolls of 35mm film, about 6 press packs, 4x5 press packs. They had rolls of movie film. They had the 35mm film, whole roll shot. And they didn't even go to lunch. They closed the photo lab, took all their photo gear over there, and they had the lab people process it out while they watched. They got all their prints, hundreds of prints, because they'd shot in 36-shot rolls in several rolls, and the 4x5 press. So the photo lab printed them all up, developed them all out, and printed them all up. Now, the standard routing for this at the time was 8 copies. They made 8 copies of everything, and this report was several hundred pages thick. It was about 4.5 inches thick with all the photographs in it and all the narrative testimony. So it was made in 8 copies and for normal distribution. And I'll try to remember what that was. 1 copy stayed at the home base. Another one went to the rest of the copies, the 7 copies went to the command headquarters, which was Headquarters 12th Air Force at Waco at the time. Waco pulled off a copy and kept it and sent a copy to ADC and another copy to Air Materiel Command, and the remaining 4 copies to headquarters, up through intelligence channels to Headquarters Air Force. We don't know what they did with all of those. So we heard about this, so we went out there to see what the base would tell us. They told us nothing happened. So we asked if we could see the files. We talked to the photo lab people that worked on the project, and at this time I had Rudy Pestalozzi with me, who was there at the time and made the reports. And he had retired and moved to Tucson, and I knew him at George Air Force Base before either of us retired. We met, and he was telling me about this report. I never heard anything about it till Rudy retired and came to Tucson, because nothing got in our newspapers and nothing leaked out. It was carefully stopped. And so he tells me about it, so we went out to the base to look for the base copy that he turned into him. And all there was a telegram in the file with a code number for the telegram and ordering to package the file and send it up the channels. So they sent their package to their big file to headquarters 12th Air Force. When we went to headquarters 12th Air Force to look for it, ours had been packaged with theirs, and the two had gone someplace else. And I believe that all those, that up the channels, they were all collected in one place at the top level and put in the files. So there was a magnificent report. Now, this, you've heard of Dr. James McDonald from the University of Arizona. He was teaching, he was an atmospheric sciences professor. And he was teaching a class in mathematics that Rudy Pestalozzi, the former intelligence officer from Western Air Defense Force area, was sitting in the class. And something came up about UFOs, and the class snickered, and the professor snickered too. Well, you know, it's foolish. And Rudy felt bad about this because he knows what's going on. So he went up to the professor after class left, and he said, "I noticed you took that lightly. Do you think there is no such thing to this?" The professor says, "Of course, Blue Book explained it all long ago." Rudy said, "My poor man," he said, "would you like to know more about it?" The professor says, "Did you know anything?" And he said, "Yes, I handled some of the reports. If you'd like to know something more, come to my house tonight at 8 o'clock and we'll give you some information," showing to demonstrate that Blue Book doesn't get all the information. So we gave him this case and 4 other cases that he could go to Wright Field and verify that they went through Wright Field, but they didn't go to Project Blue Book. So he took his summer vacation that year to do it. And he went to Wright Field, and he didn't find them in Project. He found that at that time he found that the project, then it was Project Blue Book files, were only had a low classification and didn't have any real meat in their files. And he went upstairs and he got people to admit that there were other reports, but that he didn't have any classification to see them. So he went to see the commanding general of Air Materiel Command, and they called in another general, and he said, "What's happening to all these reports? I know this was sent to you. I have interviewed the man that prepared it. Now, has anybody seen it here, or was it lost?" The general said, "Well, yeah, we saw it, went through." But he said, "Well, where is it now?" He said, "We sent them up, just like, you know, we always do." So he said, "Well, where do you send it?" They said, "Ours went to Washington." So we went, McDonald went to Washington. He was looking for it in the Pentagon. He couldn't score anything there. So at that time, that president was having a presidential breakfast every morning, and he would invite a couple of congressmen and a couple of senators to sit in with his cabinet for the breakfast briefing. And the custom was the president would make his statement to his staff. Then he would invite the staff in order of rank on down to comment on it or offer anything that they wanted to contribute to the meeting that morning. And as a courtesy, he went to each of the congressmen and senators that were visiting. They didn't want to rise and offer anything either, but McDonald, sitting with our representative, stood up and says, "Yes, I have something I'd like to offer. I'd like to ask a question." And the president, I forget who the president was at the time, but we could easily find out. It was about, it was shortly before McDonald died, whenever that was. Anyway, he asked the question, "Where are these reports going? I know they're not going to Project Blue Book. So where are they going?" Everybody looked away like that. They didn't want to answer it. Finally, the president looked around. Nobody wants to answer it. He didn't want to answer it either. He said, "Well, I don't know. We don't have that information. You'll have to brief the people over in the Pentagon, or go see them." So he didn't get his answer. He did cause some consternation in the cabinet. He came back from that feeling like he had scored a point, or picked a sore anyway, as far as the government was concerned. And it was shortly after that, only a few weeks after that, that he was suicided when a pistol was put in his mouth and fired up in his head. That bullet went between the 2 brain halves, severed most of one optic nerve and part of another one, so he was essentially blind. He was in intensive care in St. Mary's Hospital in Tucson, in an intensive care ward, watched round the clock by nurses. He's in hospital clothes, recovering a garment that ties on the back and has no back in it, hospital slippers. His clothes have been taken and locked up in a locker. And in the middle of the night, the first night that he's recovering from the gunshot wound, he disappears from the hospital. And they couldn't find him in the hospital, but the next morning they found him in the desert, 4 miles out of town, with another bullet from the left into the left temple, across the head, and he's right-handed. The gun left at the site was his own, the doctor's own gun, Dr. McDonald's own gun. That gun had to come from a shoebox on the second shelf of a closet, his clothes closet in his bedroom, where his wife was sleeping behind a locked door. The house door was locked, and he's in hospital clothes, and he's gone from St. Mary's Hospital to his home, probably 4 or 5 miles, at night in the dark in hospital clothes and hospital slippers, and successfully got in a locked door, into a locked bedroom, got the gun, got back out again, and went 4 miles out in the desert. Tell me that's suicide, but that's how he was reported. That's how it was classified. And his insurance was paid off, and his family told it was a suicide. So, is it a suicide, or was he suicided twice? Not once, but twice. People often ask me after a presentation, they say, well, where are they? And where do they come from, and what are they doing here? And the answer is not a simple answer. It is not a simple they, and it's not a simple activity. And I have investigated over 100 cases in great detail where the aliens came back over and over to the same contactee and watched the changes in his life and the developments as they progressed, and been able to measure and verify them. And in that 100 and some cases, I'll say, let's round it to 100, I have only found 2 cases that might be coming from the same place doing the same thing, and that was reticulum. The Betty and Barney Hill had an indication that after Marjorie Fisher's examination of the evidence that the astronomical configuration that she saw on the screen might have included reticulum, Zeta 1 and Zeta 2 of reticulum. The aliens didn't tell her where they came from, because they said, if you don't know where your sun is, what good will it do us to show you where we come from? So Marjorie Fish concluded that those came from reticulum, and they may have, because their appearance was very much like the ones that were contacting William Herman in North Charleston, South Carolina. Those little beings that are typically called grays today, and pretty much match the ones that were described by Betty Barney Hill, told him that they came, specifically, that they came from a planet they call, from a planet that orbits one of twin suns that they call reticulum. And when we look at the constellation Reticulum, which means the net, we see 2 suns, big, bright suns, together. And they told Herman, who is not an astronomer at all, that the 2 suns are twin suns that run parallel in sidereal space, which meant nothing to Bill Herman. So when I reported that to the astronomers at Kate Peaks, I laughed and says, there's no such thing as twin suns. In astronomy, there's no, every time there's 2 stars close together, they're binary. They become binary. He says that the astrophysics makes them binary. So I said, well, watch these 2 and tell me if you can find out whether they're really twin suns running parallel in sidereal space, or if they're really binary. If they're binary, they must have a long period. So that was 15 years ago, and just recently one of the astronomers called me and said, you know, those 2 suns in reticulum do seem to be parallel suns, running parallel in sidereal space. They do not appear to be binaries, and they're changing the catalog to show this. So those reticulans told Bill Herman that they came from one of them, and that in their same sun system there was another planet that had evolved beings traveling in space. We've never met them. So that was a kind of a confirmation, but these were different. They're not humans like the Pleiadians. These are the other species. Now, there's an interesting study that was done in 1979. Both MUFON in the United States and CUFON, an equivalent in Canada, took all the known cases and plotted them and looked for comparisons. And they ran tables and graphs and charts, and they found, as a result of the study, it lasted months, that working from known data, they found that about 1/3 of the visitors to this planet were humans just like us. Different morphology, different appearances and so forth. Bigger ears, smaller ears, changing them out, bigger eyes, less, hair no hair at all on the body, but human creatures, placental human creatures like us, animals. Second category, the first third was humans, the second third was what we commonly call grays today, and the reticulans would fit in that category. There are a lot of grays. There's only one gray species that comes from reticulum, and that's often confused. But the second category being those gray types, they are non-placental creatures. You saw one on the autopsy table in the Santilli film. They don't have any gastrointestinal system. They don't have any sex organs. They are a different class of being altogether. We don't even know for sure whether they're animal or not. And they didn't have any sex organs, distinguishable sex organs, so we don't know what sex they are. And then the third class is a catch-all category. Third is a catch-all category that includes everything else, the tentacled species, the fuzzy blobs, hairy balls, and all that sort of thing. There's a lot of different varieties, but there's a great. Now this pretty much confirms the statements that the other statement I made earlier, that the nature of contact with this planet is infinitely varied. None of the species are the same. None of the humans are exactly alike. None of the grays are exactly alike, and all of the exotic different species are all different from each other. So that would also tend to confirm the fact that they all come from different planets, from different sources, and they have different technologies and doing different things. Yet they're intelligent enough to produce vehicles and be traveling in space. And that ought to be interesting. The possibilities are so vast. What their objectives are, I would have to believe from what I see that each one has his own game, that there is no common approach to the Earth species, that we're just another species that is being examined by different species because we are different from them in some degree. The humans are examining us because we're different humans. The other species because we're different creatures. And I don't see any peculiar pattern of contact here myself, because it appears that we're accidentally discovered by, there doesn't seem to be any program of contact to this planet except by a given species from a given planet at a given time. And there doesn't seem to be any organized relationship involving this planet that would indicate a major project of some kind by somebody. So I've got to believe that our planet, our sun even, is off in the boonies. It's not a part of a regular traffic system. We don't have regular visitors. The ones that find us are happenstance, and they appear here occasionally when they discover what appears to be intelligent life on this planet. And I find evidence in the way that develops that many of the alien visitors only encounter other alien visitors here. That space is so vast and the cosmos is so vast that they just don't encounter each other until they're both in the same place at the same time doing something related. So the reticulans met the Pleiadians here, and they didn't know about them before that because there was no traffic with them. I believe that there is an ongoing program with at least one race, and possibly more. And I got to tell you about a friend of mine, I won't give you his name, who was an engineer at Area 51. And if I give you any more about that, he'd be identifiable. But his job was an important job, and he spent a whole career there, retired from his job there. In about the 1960s, apparently our government made contact with an alien extraterrestrial visitor where they negotiated an arrangement to provide a surface facility for the aliens to operate from in exchange for some technology. And that's scuttlebutt all over the area, but there is some substance in fact. So when the agreement was reached, the alien society laid some requirements on our government. They said we would have to provide a suitable habitat for the beings that they would send here from their society. And they gave us some very specific instructions for it. The laboratory facility had to have 2 nozzles in the shower, one for water and one for enzymes. And they would bring enzymes from their home planet to be put in a tank to be dispensed through the second nozzle. The enzymes were lathed over the body first and rubbed in. They stand there for a time, and then they rinse off with water, and the water and the enzymes are collected at the bottom, and the enzymes are filtered out, put back in the tank, and the water is flushed away. That was one of the requirements. Another was a food requirement. They don't eat alimentation such as ours. They brought alimentation from their home planet that we had to learn to culture here in Area 51 to provide a food source for their diet. Our government was charged with the responsibility to produce the food from their products continually for alimentation for the guest visitors. Now those guest visitors arrived in an operational vehicle that they still keep operation of. They can go and come. They fly in and out of their habitat facility at will. They're not restrained in any way. But my engineer friend was one of the several engineers that were assigned to work with the extraterrestrials to try to bridge the gap between their technology and ours. And in 20 years of research trying to do so, they never succeeded in closing the gap. Were never able to convert that technology to ours. And the reason given by the aliens themselves is because in order to operate their equipment, they have to impart a certain mental input. And we have never learned to impart the input that's necessary to make the machines work. So their equipment responds to mind, to thought, and we have never learned to impart the proper thought to make any of it work. There is no way that we can bridge the gap with a wire from this point to that point, from theirs to ours, and make it work. There's no such wire. And that's interesting because those aliens are, I think one is very ill now and about to die, but they've been there since the 60s. That's for 35 years. And we've been trying to solve the problem all that time and haven't succeeded. That's one entity that I know about. There were two of them involved, two aliens involved, one craft. There may be others that I don't know about. That one I am quite sure is legitimate and real. The last I heard is one of those alien beings. We don't know whether they're males or females either because they don't have any sex organs. But they have not reproduced out there. They do go and come as they please, and sometimes they're seen by others outside or even in Area 51. They're not detained, but it's an interesting experiment because there may be other programs going on that are not as beneficent. Okay, my friend from Area 51 told me an interesting story about an event that happened out there. We had another crash come down about 8 miles north by northwest of Kingman, Arizona, at the old Kingman Air Base, northwest of Kingman Air Base. And that one was successfully recovered by teams from Area 51 using Area 51 equipment. There were 4 living aliens in that. All 4 of them were evacuated to Los Alamos, where they had already prepared a habitat for such events. And when the Area 51 team got the ship back to Area 51, it was beeping the whole time it was on the ground. When they got back to Area 51, it was still beeping. They couldn't figure out how to stop the beeping. And after a week of the irritating beeping that they just couldn't seem to turn off, somebody says, well, why don't we get the occupants to come back and turn it off? So they drove the occupants back from Los Alamos in a carryall to Area 51, indicated by sign language what they wanted them to do. They acknowledged and they said they'd have to go aboard. They didn't want to let them go aboard. They thought they'd take the ship off and fly away. But they finally consented. That's the only way they're going to stop it. They sent a guard in with them, and the guard came out vomiting in just a few seconds. And the crew is in there together alone. Craft didn't start up and fly away. Probably couldn't anyway. They turned the sound off and came back to the door. The carryall backed up, and they loaded them, took them back to Los Alamos. Now, Los Alamos is involved, and that has been involved all along. So I'll tell you another story. My friend, the engineer, after 20 years of trying to solve the problem of bridging the gap between the technologies, is invited in 1968. Well, it wasn't 20 years by then. He was invited to Los Alamos for a project review conference. And they had about 18 scientists that all had been working on the project, various stages of the project, gathered around a big oval table in the Los Alamos headquarters with Edward Teller, the head of the Atomic Energy Commission, sitting at the head of the table. One of the aliens on the opposite side of the table from my engineering friend put in a white shirt and slacks so he would look less alien, but he still had his alien bigger head, bigger eyes, black eyes. And he was sitting in the conference, and the only people that he could understand everybody else because he was telepathic. And the only way he could communicate, though, was the signs that he had developed with my engineer friend to answer the question. But here's a man, an alien from another planet, sitting in a conference in 1968 in Los Alamos headquarters on the progress of learning how to bridge the gap between the alien technology and ours, which we have never succeeded in doing. Is a profound case that was thrown away when it came out. Everything was filed in the round file. None of the clubs had possessed it, so they didn't investigate it. They didn't do anything about it. They all knocked it. The government raised their usual programs of disinformation against it. The guy didn't say that I don't need this. I have my own truth. I don't need to try to explain to people that I have to educate first before I can even tell them anything about it. To hell with it. So he wouldn't talk to anybody. He pulled in his horns, and his case continued. His contacts continued. They went on for a long time. He said he'd been taken to the moon twice since then by them and twice to their home planet. But he's not going to write anything on his visits to the home planet because they asked him not to. When we came back from Switzerland, we had 8 stages of metal samples. They told us that their metal was synthesized from space, and that they in the mothership they collected space, primordial space, and they condensed it step by step until and they stored it in matter banks. From that they could synthesize anything they need. So they would produce whatever they wanted from their synthesis banks. Now, the metals that they made were the result of their synthesis programs. So they offered to bring us 3 stages of metal for us to examine. And of the 3 states, one was a metal in a lower primary state before it was really specific. It was dark, almost amorphous. And they brought us another stage that was a little brighter, and then a stage that was quite bright, and then a stage that was bright goldish. And they told us each of these represented a successive stage of refinement to the useful form of metal that they used in their ships. We found that all of the metals involved, or all of the chemical metals involved, were highly electric. So we worried about they're all going to be soft. However, they said that their ships were protected by a force field. So the force field you would require high electrical conductivity to get good results for the force field. So that's maybe the result, maybe why they resorted to that kind of metal. Anyway, we got back, and I took my specimens to the University of Arizona, to the metallurgical department there, headed by Dr. Walter W. Walker. And he looked at them and he said, "Oh, these are interesting." He's also a member of APRO. He says, "These are really interesting. I'd like to take a look at them." So he studied them a bit. When I went down to see him a couple days later, "What did you find?" "Well," he said, "we're going to have to take them to some other more advanced equipment than I've got here." He said, "Roughly they're one-third silver, one-third copper, one-third gold." But he said there's trace elements in there also. He said, "However, you can't quote me." He said, "I won't give you any writing on this. Now, you can't take a picture of the laboratory that did it. Don't mention my lab," and all that sort of thing. So not going to do us a damn bit of good. So I said, "Why not?" He said, "Well," he said, "this is an exotic subject. It's our business is not studying metal samples from a UFO." He said, "Take it elsewhere." He said, "I'd recommend you get somebody that has some high-tech electronic scanning equipment." So we found a shop that had a laboratory that had that. And they gave us a little bit more information. They said that it's a strange metal. They said that it's a synthesis, that the metal shows that it is not synthesized from discrete metals mixed together or poured together. They said that on the electron scanning microscope we get sharp spikes and a normal flow of spikes down to very low ones. They said this tells us that the metal is crossing has all of the metals in it, but larger quantities of some. So they said, "We can't give you a report on this, so we're not in that kind of business." So then we finally found Marcel Vogel out at IBM, who was the inventor of the electronic data transfer. He's the one that invented magnetic tape and magnetic disks for computers. We took the metal to him, and he was very interested in it. He took it to the IBM laboratories to study it, and he come back with it. He studied for a week before he'd even talked to us. And then we were out there to see him, and he said, it's a really a unique substance. He says, I agree that it's nothing we can make on this planet. He said, first of all, he said, it's not been in a molten state. He said, this is formed by a cold fusion process in a vacuum. He said, we have a cold fusion process, electrolytic, but he said it's not in a vacuum. He said, it's never been heated, there's no bubbles in it, and there's no ash. He said, so the assembly of this metal is rather unique. He said, when I turned a high intensity quartz beam on it, it began to dematerialize before my eyes, so I had to turn it off quick to keep from losing it. He said, the crystal stacking in the metal, metal is made up of crystals, metal crystals. He said, the crystal stacking in the metal is such that it's highly conductive. He says, it's more conductive than any of those metals by themselves. And he said, I find trace elements of rhenium and thulium in them. He says, those are unstable elements. By themselves, they quickly decay into something else, but they're stable in this alloy that you brought me. He said, so these trace elements may be doing something. He says, we make supermagnets by putting trace earths, rare earths in metal. And he says, we get magnets that are 20,000 times stronger than ordinary magnets. He says, these may be doing something like that, but we don't know. We don't have any laboratory work on it. He says, it is highly electrical. He says, it's highly conductive, all of it. But he said, yeah, it's mostly, roughly, it's copper, silver, and gold again. He gave us a television report, which is in a document we call the metal samples, that he would only do on video in his own laboratory. And he wouldn't give us anything on IBM stationery. He wouldn't give us anything on his own stationery. He says, I'm not afraid of the peer pressure, but because, as he said, I am the peer. But he said, this is not healthy for the company I work for. They don't like me doing this. So he said, I'll give you the television report as a private citizen. You can't show that I work for my bosses or anything else, and you may do what you want with it. So we put it in what we called, it was a video presentation, about 30 minutes of the metal samples. Oh yes, my interest was piqued in what was happening in Alaska, and they wouldn't let me have anything there, so I began. So they wouldn't let me take anything home. They wouldn't let me learn anything what was happening in Alaska except what I was getting out of the interrogations. They wouldn't let me talk to anybody about it. Those were all highly classified. So I began watching the newspapers for any newspaper reports. I started buying magazines that had a UFO article in the magazine and collecting these. And from those I would get names and addresses. And I often called the people who wrote the articles to get them. Then I'd go interview those people myself, and if they took pictures, I'd try to get a copy of the picture, and frequently did. And then I began trading the pictures that I already had with other people that had pictures to get more pictures, and eventually built a library of pictures, probably the largest in private hands in the world. Is over 4,000 pictures of real UFOs. Now, if I can collect that many alone as a single individual working by myself, how many pictures do you think the government has got when every government employee is a potential investigator? Every agent trained investigator, all collecting and contributing to the government file. They must have hangars full of pictures. At a international UFO conference in Acapulco, just like this. And I had gone down with Jim Lorenzen, who was the head of APRO, the first UFO civilian or civilian UFO research organization in the world, organized right here in Tucson. We flew down to Acapulco. Hynek had been invited to speak there. And we had dinner with Hynek the first night because he and Jim Lorenzen knew each other. And I found him to be an affable man. He didn't say much because he had learned not to commit himself on a position over the swamp gas and several other things that already happened by then. So when I came back from Switzerland with the photographs and the information that I was collecting in the Swiss case, I released some of the information in a meeting like this in Oakland, California one time. It was immediately attacked by everybody because they didn't have it, including all the clubs, including my own club in Tucson, APRO. They said that I stole their case. But I went there to find out about it myself for the first time. Anyway, I got a call a couple of years into the investigation of the case from a woman in Tucson, in Phoenix, asking me if I could come to Tucson and tell her about the Pleiades case. And I said, yeah, I can, but that's a little inconvenient. Is it important? She says, I think it's important. I think you'll find it important. So I agreed, and I drove up to Phoenix, and I met her in the afternoon. She said, come about supper time, we'll have a bite to eat. I got there about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and I rang her doorbell, and she opened the door, and she said, there's somebody here I want you to meet. And she opened the door a little further, and there's Hynek standing there, and he greeted me. He said, hello. He said, come on in. And I went in, and he said, now I would like you to tell me something about this Pleiades case you're investigating. But he said, I'm not going to ask any questions. I'm not going to answer any questions. He said, I don't want to be committed in any way on this, but I'd like you to tell me what you know. So I showed him some of the pictures and told him something about the case, and he listened patiently, and we got through. He just thanked me, and I picked up my stuff and left. He never did really attack the Pleiades case, but everybody else all did because they weren't included in it. MUFON attacked me because we didn't include them in the investigation. Now, there's a reason why we didn't. I've never been a member of any UFO organization because they're always backbiting each other. So I tried to stay out of that, but I was closely associated with APRO because I knew Coral and Jim very well, and I used to help them put out their bulletin. I helped them file material in the office. I helped them in many ways because I was retired and had time to do it. Helped them prepare their newsletter. But they kind of turned against me when I came back with the Pleiades case and wouldn't turn it over to them. Now, the reason I didn't turn it over to them is none of these clubs had any money to investigate anything. They publish a little bulletin, their subscriptions to the bulletin barely paid for it, but they had no fund to send anybody anywhere to investigate anything. So I had to go on my own time and my own money, and I figured, if that's the case, why should I try to give it all to them? And it was going to take some serious research of the data that I was bringing. I had metal samples, I had plastic samples, I had a lot of things to be tested. And again, they had no money to do any of this. All of this is going to require money for testing. So I involved some other people with me to help finance some of the work that we were doing. So it was for this reason that most of the clubs now, the APRO began to publish attacks on the case in their own APRO journal, which I was helping them write. and they criticized the Swiss farmers, saying that he was a fraud and a fake, and that he might even be fooling some of our investigators and a few things like that. So I quit coordinating information with them. I just decided I don't need all the problem. And they reached the stage where they even took my key away and wouldn't let me in the office anymore. I went on my own money. I never would have gone back a second time on my own money or anybody's money if I had ever had any reason to suspect fraud or funny business in the case. When I got there, I found the most sincere, honest guy I ever saw. He looked you straight in the eye when he talked to you, looked right into your soul, and he didn't look away. When I asked him questions about making models and things like that, he showed me the models. He said, I can't make one. I have one arm. I can't cover anything. But he said, I do get models. His first one was from a 12-year-old neighbor boy in a shop class at school. He turned one out on a lathe, waxed it out, and brought it to him. He had it on his desk. He showed that one to me. And he says, others brought me other models. He said, they're models, but they're not the real thing. He says, models are easy to tell. So anyway, the case had a lot going for it. He had the best photographs I'd ever seen. And that's usually suspect. If the pictures are good, they're probably too good. But these stood all the testing that we could give them. And even over, more than 20 years of testing now, we haven't been able to find any way that they could have been faked. They're not montages, they're not double images, none of the regular things. Now we learned, in the process of testing these things, we learned a lot. We learned that we can take a still two-dimensional photograph, and by examining the photograph with computers and measuring pixels and everything else, we can find out if any object in the picture is moving, which direction it's moving, and about how fast, by counting the pixels on the edges. We found that we can estimate distance from the camera with respect to other objects in the picture by 6 different methods. One of them is haze factor, gray factor, color saturation, depth of field, well, counting pixels is a good example. Also, that has to do with the dispersion of light over distance. The less sharp the field is, the further the light has traveled. So when we apply all 6 of those methods and find that the result is roughly within 10% of each other, and when we measured one of the pictures, for example, and found that the craft was hovering over a log pile 120 yards away, then knowing the geometry of the lens, we just simple mathematics, you can multiply it out and find that if that's 20 yards from the lens and it's that size in the image frame, then it's got to be 20 feet in diameter. And the witness was telling us it was about 7 meters in diameter, which is about 21 feet. So all of our tests came out like that. There are other tests for color shading, reflection of light from different sources around it. If it's a small model, it reflects it differently from a large object. And so there were people that come along and said, oh, he made them with models. We can make pictures just like that with models in 10 minutes. So there's a fellow, Michael Horn, that has taken the debunkers on out there in California, and he offered a lot of money for anybody that could duplicate just one picture. After a year with no duplications, he offered to, he said, well, you didn't do it with everything open. You had a freehand to do it any way you could, all the technicians you want, all the labs you want, in a laboratory if you like, and everything else. He said, now I'd like to narrow it down a little bit. He said the man had a broken camera. He couldn't change the focus. His focus was jammed just a little bit short of infinity, about a 16th of an inch maybe, short of the infinity focus on his camera. It had been dropped and the ring was bent and it was jammed. The same action broke the mirror loose beside the lens viewer, so he couldn't look through the camera anymore, and he had to shoot all of his pictures from the hip, so to speak. So then he said, and you should do it with all those settings. You should be stuck with the infinity setting, fixed focus, no lens. Another one. He shot everything at 125th of a second with his broken camera. All of it was shot on ASA 100 slide transparency film. He said, now I'd like to limit you to some of those. He didn't get anything for another year, and he said, well, you didn't do it that way. Now let's do it with one arm. This man has only one arm besides his broken camera. Still no response, so he's ordered the people that offered money for anybody that can come up with a picture. He told them they ought to pay up, because Billy will make another one for them. I am absolutely convinced. I found other eyewitnesses. I didn't go around the neighborhood knocking doors wherever these things happen. And I found other witnesses that didn't know anything about Billy Meyer, and he didn't know anything about them, that had seen something descend into the woods nearby and rise from the woods 20 minutes later at the same time that Billy was having a contact. I found a man that was a computer programmer that lived on a hill overlooking one of the sites, and he had come home from work one day, saw the object slowly descending into the clearing behind the trees, landed behind the trees. He called his wife out. They both stood there and watched for 25 or 30 minutes until it rose in the air and flew away. They never heard of Billy Meyer, and Meyer never heard of them, but we found them just by knocking doors in the neighborhoods looking for anybody that had ever seen anything strange out there. And we found a number of them. Oh, I'm absolutely convinced that it's real. There's no doubt in my mind whatsoever. And I went back 12 or 13 times. I lived in the household with the man and his family for 81 days overall, collectively. And I knew all of them very well. And I was there one day when I'd been there for 4 or 5 days already, living in the household with them, sleeping in one of the bedrooms in their house. When he got up one morning, it'd been raining all the day before and the night before, and he got up, it was wet and soggy outside, and he had a cold, he thought he was coming down with the flu. He was a heavy smoker, and he didn't light a cigarette. He drank a lot of coffee, he didn't take coffee. He walked around a little bit, went and laid down on a sofa in the living room in front of the television set. Stayed there all day long. He didn't feel like getting up. He hadn't drunk any water. They brought him water, and he didn't drink it. He didn't drink coffee, he didn't smoke. And by about 5 o'clock in the afternoon, I hear him. I'm watching the television with my back to him, and I heard a movement And I looked around, and he's down there like this, motioning for me to come over. So I went over there and bent down to see what he had. He said, "Get Elsie." So I went to get Elsie. She was one of the women in the household there. And she came and did the same thing, and he told her something, and she went to get his wife, and between the two of them, they picked him up and walked him down the hallway to his bedroom. They evidently put him in a tub because for every contact he had, he changed all of his clothes from the inside out, wearing all fresh clothes, having taken a bath if he had time just before leaving. So they left his underclothes in there, and his wife came out with a shirt and jeans, which he always wore. And she put up the ironing board and started ironing those, and Elsie brought the boots out and started washing those, scrubbing them up, then polished them and set them aside. Then he came walking out. His wife took the shirt and pants in. He came walking out with the shirt and pants on, and she took the empty sleeve and pinned it up for him. And Elsie had laid out his pistol, gun, and a walkie-talkie, and he sat down at the table, and he took the pistol out of the holster, opened the barrel, dumped the cartridges out, looked down the barrel at both, and put them all back in, put it back together, put it in the holster, strapped it on. Then he took the walkie-talkie, opened it up, dumped the batteries out, put fresh batteries in it. No matter how bad the other batteries were, I thought this might be a waste of equipment. Maybe it will work, but he didn't want to take any chances on it not working. They'd had problems already with it, for lack of that. So they had learned how to prepare for the meeting. So now he's all ready to go, and he's dressed, and it's about 6 o'clock in the evening. This all started about 5:30. Well, it's probably closer to 6:30. The men had come in from work, had seen what was going on, went and washed up and came back, sat down at the table. The women had served them supper, and Billy and his wife and Elsie are standing at the end of the table by the stove, cook stove. Over the stove was a clock with a round face with big numbers on it. And I'm on the far end of the kitchen pouring a cup of coffee. When he raised his hand and a little signal like that, he got the final word to go telepathically and started out the door. I set my coffee cup down so hard I spilled it, ran around the table, following him out. I want to see him go this time. So I've never been able to catch him this close to a departure. And I got out the kitchen door, which went down 2 steps to the ground, and in a lean-to shed that went to the end of the house with a spring-loaded door that opened inward. So I got on the ground out there in time to see his heels going through the end door, and I ran about 8 or 9 steps to it, jerked it open. I don't want to miss anything, and there out in the wet ground in the mud was 1, 2, 3 steps like that, no 4th step. And so I looked all around. There's no noise, no lights. It's quiet. The rain is still falling. And I thought, gee, and I missed it. And so I stayed out there in the rain until I got soaking wet. And I went back in to change clothes, and I put dry clothes on, and somebody gave me a raincoat. And I was going back out I didn't want to miss anything. I'm going to be there when he comes back. And as I came down the stairs, I saw in the living room the Germans are standing in front of the television set watching it. So I went over and looked over their shoulder to see what they're watching, and there was a black screen with a white cross that said in German, "The Pope has died." So I said, "How did he die?" And they said, "We don't know. The program just stopped, and this came on the screen." I watched for maybe 30 seconds or more, but I don't want to miss what's going on outside. So I went back outside in the rain to wait for Billy to come back. And I was out there about 15 or 20 more minutes when a telephone rang, and somebody answered it upstairs, and they raised the window and said, "He's down over at Elg, and you can go with Jacobus and his wife to pick him up." Well, Elg was on the other side of the mountain. His walkie-talkie is line of sight, so he had to use a telephone to call home. He walked from wherever they let him out, probably right in front of a guest house. When we got in a black Volkswagen, splish and splash through puddles, rain splashing all over the windshield and over the top of the car, trying to get to him. And he had gone out in the rain, and now we're going to pick him up, still in the rain, someplace else. He's standing under one of those little 3-board roofs over a 3-step landing on the side of a guest house, which is closed for the night. And he's not wet. Doesn't have any raindrops on his jacket. His hair is dry. His shoes only had a little bit of mud around the soles, nothing on the top. You know, if you walk on a muddy street, you get mud on the top and everything, everywhere. He didn't have any of that. So he got in the car, and trying to make conversation, he just looked forward. He didn't want to talk, and I tried several times. I just gave up and leaned back. We got back to the house. Took us about 15 minutes to go each direction, and they went inside, and he walked into the living room. The Germans followed him in there, closed the door. So I knew that they were going to get whatever information he wanted to tell them, and that I probably wasn't invited at that stage. I waited a couple hours, never did open up, so I went up and went to bed. The next morning I came down early, and one of the girls came down shortly, just a few minutes after I was going to make me some coffee, came down. I said, "What time did the meeting break up last night?" She said, "Oh, not last night." I said, "Well, when did it break up?" She said, "About 6 o'clock this morning." I said, "Oh, God, he'd be sleeping on late, huh?" She said, "Well, he'll be up soon." So about 9 o'clock he got up and came out, and he just nodded a greeting to me at the table. I was sitting there drinking a cup of coffee. They brought him one. He sat down for a minute, then he looked at me and jerked his head like that for me to follow him, and we got up and went outside to sit on the patio. And we sat down. I'm dying to find out what happened that night. I knew he had gone to a contact, and I'm fresh after the contact, and I want whatever he can tell. I said, "Gee, Bill, can you tell me what happened last night?" He looked at me with kind of sad eyes, and he said, "I watched him murder a pope." I said, "You got to be kidding. We don't murder popes anymore. They might have done that in the Dark Ages. It's the modern world. We don't murder popes." He said, "I watched them murder a pope." And I said, "A pope?" This is Pope Paul VI. I said, "A pope? Can't be. And he said, "Yes." He said, "I watched everything on viewing screens." Now, this has never been published either. He said, they showed me a screen of the Vatican, several views in the Vatican, one of his desk, one of his bedroom, one in the kitchen. The Pope is getting ready for bed. He went to bed about 8:30 in the evening usually. And they all knew this. And his manservant is in the kitchen preparing a warm tea that he customarily took before he got into bed. And he's at a table in the kitchen preparing the tea, and there's a cardinal standing there in his cardinal's frock, cassock or whatever it is, with his hands in the pockets. And the manservant got the tray ready and looked at it, and then he left and went into through an arch at the side and over to another room to get a fresh linen napkin. While he was doing that, the cardinal took his hand out of his pocket with a little bottle in it, took the stopper out, put 2 drops in the tea, put the stopper back and put it back in his pocket. When the manservant came out, the cardinal was standing there just like he was before, with his hands in his pockets. The manservant picked up the tray and took it into that Pope, left it with him, and came out and went about 5 minutes. Then he went down and opened the door and looked in on the Pope. If you remember, the Vatican put out the word that a chambermaid found him the next morning, that was the first one to see him dead. Well, there's a cardinal who saw him dead before that. When he was sure that he wasn't moving, wasn't breathing, he went to the Pope's office and took a folder off the desk. And the Palladians showed Meyer on the screen what was in the folder. It was a report of the losses of the Vatican, huge loss, millions of dollars of losses from the Vatican treasury and bad investments with the mafia. And the Pope had discovered, that Pope, Paul VI, had discovered this and was going to report the loss the next morning, going to call a news conference, report the loss, and appoint an investigative committee. Well, the investigative committee would have got several of the people that are involved in the loss. The treasurer, the highest ranking cardinal that serves as the secretary for that Pope, and a couple others. And so Myers says, then they told him what chemical was used, was in the bottle. And it's a chemical, I don't remember the name now, but the chemical is a chemical that's used by intelligence that causes, for assassinations, that causes a cramp in the heart that lasts about 10 minutes, long enough to kill you. And the chemical is so volatile that it evaporates out of the body in the heat of the body itself and is gone by the time any autopsy or anything like that can be performed.